She didn't see it coming. Nobody does. The ground vanishes, the door slams shut, and everything familiar turns to dust. One day she had a home, a name, a routine. The next, there was only silence and a gate that locked without explanation. And maybe that's one of the greatest violences of all. Being yanked out of your own story without warning, without defense, without a voice. Clara stood there, suspended before nothingness, wondering if this was a nightmare or simply reality hitting too hard. When life evicts us, it doesn't ask if we're ready. It just tears us out. And there, roofless and mapless, she had to face herself as never before. On the street, everything is a mirror. What hurts isn't just the cold or the fear, it's the nakedness, the helplessness of having nowhere to return to and not knowing if anyone would even miss you. Standing before the abrasive concrete and a night that falls without mercy, Clara realized that being without shelter also meant being without distractions. No walls left to hide her thoughts. No bed to numb the pain. Just her, just the echo of footsteps and memories. And that's when the truth shows itself, because everything missing on the outside throws open what you still carry within. And Clara carried more than she ever imagined. She thought she'd lost everything. Yet little by little, she noticed she wasn't completely empty. There was still ground beneath her feet. And ground, however hard, is a beginning, a place you can stand, even with bruised soles. It's there, in the fall, that you discover how deep your roots go. Clara hadn't walked away. She'd been pushed. But in falling, she found a foothold. Her own body, her own breath, her own memory. And that encounter doesn't hurt any less for being necessary. It hurts a lot, but it's the kind of pain that, instead of destroying, reveals. Because being thrown out of your house is also being shoved in front of a mirror that doesn't forgive, a mirror that doesn't filter, doesn't edit, doesn't comfort. Only those with courage stay in that reflection. Courage to see what's always been there, hidden behind walls, paperwork, obligatory smiles. Clara stayed. She cried in silence, yes. She was afraid, yes, but she stayed. And that was already the start of a new story. Not the one she wanted, nor the one she imagined, but perhaps the one that needed to be told. There was a bench, a bit of tree shade, an exhaustion of those who walk too much without knowing where to go. Clara sat, her eyes fixed on nothing, while inside her swirled a storm nobody could see. Raphael saw her there. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. But something about that quiet woman, that posture balance between exhaustion and dignity, disarmed him. He didn't realize it, but she was a living reminder of a part of himself he had buried. The part that had also fallen, also lost, also screamed inside and wasn't heard. They said nothing. They didn't have to. Sometimes life puts two strangers together not so they can complete each other, but so they can recognize each other. Her gaze asked for nothing. It didn't beg. It was simply there, steady, even though everything around them screamed ruin. Raphael felt in his body, as if that silence had weight, history, substance. And he, accustomed to voices, contracts, meetings, was moved by something that made no sound. Because dignity has a presence no facade can fake. Clara didn't shrink. She didn't avert her eyes. She didn't try to look less wounded than she was. And that was exactly what touched Raphael. Silent resistance. The kind of strength that doesn't flaunt itself, needs no words, needs no proof. Something in that moment suspended time, as if for a second, the world around them ceased to matter. And in that second, an invisible bond was born between two weary souls that were still intact. Some silences speak louder than any speech. There are silences that shout, I'm still here. I still believe. I haven't given up. Raphael heard that silence. He felt it resonate inside him like a forgotten call. It wasn't passion. It wasn't pity. It was something deeper. A memory. A shared hurt. A seed. And without realizing it, he stayed. Not to save, not to change anything, but because in that instant, amid the world's noise and fatigue of the days, he found someone who, like him, still hadn't given up on themselves. He wanted help, but didn't know how. He went to a lawyer, talked about rights, evidence, paperwork. Yet on the way back, he realized something bigger was at stake. The real battle wasn't the courthouse. It was inside himself. Raphael started hearing an old discomfort, an indignation sleeping beneath layers of comfort. Seeing Clara there, silent yet so present, woke what time had lulled, a sense of justice. Not the kind in law books, but the other kind, the kind that starts when you look in a mirror and admit, I've stayed quiet for far too long. It wasn't just about her. It was about everything he'd let slide. All the times he chose not to get involved, not to commit, not to feel. Clara became a mirror, and Raphael saw his own abandonment reflected back. Not abandonment by others, but the abandonment he'd inflicted on himself. Her silent, contained pain pushes pain to the surface. That's when true justice began. The moment he stopped outsourcing change and accepted responsibility for where he'd gone astray. Fighting for her did matter, yes. But what drove him wasn't only the desire to see her restored. It was a need to find himself again. Raphael realized that the impulse to protect Clara was, in fact, the first act of protection he'd offered himself in a long time. To protect what still had value. To protect his own sensitivity. To protect that piece of humanity the routine had left behind. Justice sometimes comes without a gavel or a ruling. It comes in the decision not to remain silent in the face of what wounds. It comes in the act of getting up, even when everything around you says to stay seated. Raphael didn't want to be a hero. He wanted to be whole. And in that instant, looking at Clara and feeling the weight she carried, he understood he could no longer ignore what, in silence, had been screaming inside him for so long. Clara expected no rescue. She wasn't counting on salvation. She knew the world doesn't always extend a hand to those who fall. What no one saw was that behind her quiet gaze was a strength that didn't depend on applause. It was raw strength, born of having no other choice. When you lose everything, fear leaves too. What remains is a courage that doesn't shout, doesn't show itself, but moves. Clara moved like that, in discreet yet firm steps, certain that if she had to start over, she would, with whatever she had, even if it was just her own breath. She didn't want admiration. She wanted peace. And maybe that's why she was so unshakable. Anyone pushed to the depths learns to swim in the dark, to breathe slowly even with a tight chest. Learns that crying isn't weakness, it's release. And that moving forward, even with a shredded soul, is the most silent act of rebellion. Clara didn't bow. Not because she was made of iron, but because she had learned to live with the cracks without letting them break her entirely. Each step she took was a declaration that she was still alive, not unscathed, not intact, but alive. And for someone who's already lost everything, that's power. The power of owing nothing to the past, of no longer being afraid to lose again. Because those who've already fallen don't fear the fall. They fear the emptiness of not trying anymore. And Clara tried. She tried to rebuild herself, stone by stone, with the debris of what had once been home, family, history. Raphael watched with a mix of admiration and silence, because there's something sacred about someone who remains standing when the entire world pushes him to the ground. Clara didn't want an audience. She didn't want understanding. She wanted space, a place where she could exist without justifying every scar. And that very presence made her a fortress, not because she was invulnerable, but because she'd learned to use every pain as part of her foundation. She didn't need to defeat anyone. She only needed not to lose herself. And that, in the end, is the greatest victory of all. What wounded Clara wasn't the shout. It was the signature, the stamp, the coldness of a document that decreed her end without raising its voice. Amaro didn't need to raise a hand. He just needed the system as a shield, polished, articulate, full of contacts and sweet words. That's how he evicted her from her own life. His violence wasn't rooted in brutality, but in cowardice wrapped in letterhead. And perhaps that made it even harder to fight, because when abuse comes dressed as legality, the sufferer looks like the one in the wrong. Raphael realized this late. He saw, in Clara's eyes, the helplessness of someone shouting at a wall that doesn't listen. The problem wasn't only personal. It was structural, an entire machine built to protect those already born protected. Yet every empire of lies begins to crumble when someone has the courage to pull one thread. And Raphael, with a full heart and open eyes, decided to pull, not with fury, but with strategy, evidence, time, with the patience of someone who knows some battles are won in the silent persistence. Amaro kept smiling at events, handing out donations, posing for photos. But every step he took was now watched by a new consciousness awakening in Raphael. Raphael didn't want revenge, he wanted justice. And justice, in this case, meant revelation, exposing what Amaro tried to hide behind clauses, charity smiles. Raphael began investigating, not to topple a man, but because he knew that if he did nothing, he'd be accepting Clara's continued invisibility. And bit by bit, the papers began to speak. Questionable signatures, witnesses silenced by fear, manipulated contracts. The web revealed itself. With each new discovery, a new part of Raphael emerged. He was no longer just a man who wanted to help a stranger. He was someone who'd found purpose by deciding not to stay quiet. Because the real war wasn't against Amaro. It was against everything Amaro represented. And in that silent battle, Raphael already knew. Clara wasn't alone and never would be again. There was no confession, no whispered promises in the dark. What sparked between Clara and Raphael wasn't soap opera romance. It was a survivor's alliance. Two tired bodies, two marked souls, two eyes that, when they met, said, "I understand." Only those who had bled inside recognized the other's depth without needing to ask. The attraction wasn't physical. It was memory, identification, the rare feeling of standing before someone who'd seen the same abyss and also chosen to keep going. They didn't rush. They didn't hide in one another. They didn't try to complete what was missing. Each was whole in their pain, yet curious about the other's silent strength. Raphael saw in Clara the courage he'd abandoned. Clara saw in Raphael a tenderness the world seemed to have erased. They didn't touch, but they were together. They didn't declare anything, but they were present. Love there was subtle, almost imperceptible, but real. This kind of love isn't born in comfort. It's born in scarcity. It doesn't bloom with flowers, but with presence. And presence, in that context, was more than just standing beside. It was holding the silence without fleeing, staying even when everything screams to leave. And they stayed, each respecting the other's timing, each rebuilding their own ruins while sharing emotional shelter even when the roof was still uncertain. But even the quietest love needs pauses. When the world barges in, even the strongest bond can get confused. Sometimes Raphael pulled back. Sometimes Clara shut down. Not from rejection, but from fear, from needing a breath, to remember they weren't losing themselves. The bond they built was strong enough not to depend on constancy. It was built on truth. And truth, when shared respectfully, doesn't demand constant presence. It demands honest presence. And that they had. Even in silence, even at a distance, even with hearts still learning to trust. She arrived smiling. She always smiled. Roberta was one of those people who know where to press without using hands. Her weapon wasn't yelling. It was doubt. She knew a sidelong glance, a casual remark, a calculated absence could dismantle more than an argument. And so, slowly, she began poisoning what Clara and Raphael were building. She didn't attack head-on. She preferred invisible venom, the kind that settles until the victim blames herself for bleeding. Clara, who had learned to distrust the world, began to distrust herself. She wondered if she was enough, if she deserved to be there, if she was causing more harm than good. Roberta's silences were long enough to echo inside her, and the words left unsaid became voices in her head. Is he here out of pity? Am I taking a place that isn't mine? Will they pull the ground out from under me again? For a while, Raphael didn't notice. He was too deep in gathering proof, facing Amaro. But Clara's eyes changed, her body tensed, her breathing shortened. And he, who'd learned to read her silences, understood something was wrong. It wasn't an external blow. It was a kind of pain that seeps in like cold water through cracks. No screams, just contamination. Those small emotional fissures no one sees can topple an entire soul. But one day, an afternoon in quiet, a wordless touch, a prolonged look, Clara nearly broke. Raphael said nothing, just stayed. Because sometimes It's in that mute presence that truth survives. Amid Roberta's insinuations, Clara's fears, doubts growing like weeds, one certainty endured. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was shelter. It was answer. It was the only language Roberta couldn't corrupt. And Clara anchored herself there, hurt, confused, insecure. She stayed because what is real, even wounded, remains. Truth is never in a hurry, but it never forgets. It waits silently for everything to align. A voice deciding to speak, a document resurfacing, a slip by someone who thought they'd never be caught. It was like that with Amaro. For a long time, his mask seemed unbreakable. But lies hold up only until one small sound, a forgotten audio, a whisper recording, becomes a missing scream. What Clara had tried to say with her gaze, with her dignity, with her silence, now echoed in evidence. Papers once lifeless now held weight. Voices once scared now united. And truth, once ignored, began to take form. The courtroom wasn't just a courthouse anymore. It was the square, the network, the stray conversation at the market. Justice now ran through the eyes of onlookers, the mouths of those who once kept quiet, the hearts of those finally feeling the truth beat. Amaro tried to hold out, tried denial, charm, influence, deceit. But there are moments when even the most powerful man must lower his head. And when he did, the world exhaled. Not out of vengeance, but relief. Clara didn't smile, didn't shout. She just looked, and her gaze was stronger than any sentence. It was a gaze of someone who knew she'd been heard, believed, who, for the first time, didn't have to explain herself to prove she was telling the truth. She didn't celebrate with fireworks. She celebrated with silence. Some victories are too intimate for noise. The justice Clara received didn't erase the pain, but it legitimized it. And for someone discredited for so long, that is repair. Raphael watched and understood. What matters most isn't the culprit's punishment. It's the clearing of her name, the ground she regains when everyone finally sees what she always knew, that truth doesn't shout but endures and in due time triumphs. She expected nothing more. After everything, Clara had learned to walk without expectations. Life had shown dreaming too much can hurt. So when she received that crumpled newspaper, she never imagined it carried more than ink. It was page 9, almost forgotten, with a line that changed everything. Clara is an heir, not of what she'd asked for, not what she pursued, but of what had always been hers by right. It wasn't about money. It was about place, belonging, overdue yet genuine recognition. The land mentioned in the article was more than soil. It was a symbol, a piece of the world saying, "You have somewhere to stand." It was the unseen reply to every time she'd been shoved out, made into no one. Now she was someone not by papers, but by memory, by ancestry, by everything running in her blood that had been silenced until then. Clara was heir to a story others tried to erase, and now that story returned, not to be retold, but to be rebuilt. Raphael saw the change in her eyes. There was no euphoria, only reverence, because that inheritance wasn't about possession. It was about healing, touching the root of pain and discovering life still there. Clara didn't want revenge. She wanted meaning. And faced with that land, she felt it. Felt that every fall, every abandonment, every silence had led here, to a place that promised no safety, but offered a restart. And for someone who'd lost everything, that a silent miracle. She decided that land wouldn't be hers alone. She decided other women with similar stories would have their space to begin again. Because Clara knew pain leaves inheritance, yes, but it can also leave shelter. That's what she chose to be. Shelter, a launching point, a spot where others can remember who they are even when the world insists they forget. Because when one woman finds her root, she doesn't grow alone. She blooms for many. And Clara bloomed, in silence, on solid ground, in truth. She returned, not as someone circling back to the start, but as someone reclaiming the thread of a story violently cut. Clara wasn't coming back to the same house, nor was she the same woman. She returned with the keys to her own story, not in her hands, but in her eyes. It was clear. What once weighed her down now upheld her. What once hurt now protected, because some pains, when well metabolized, become fertile soil for a steadier, clearer, fuller life. She walked slowly to the door, touched the wood like someone recognizing, not invading, because now the house was an extension of her, not just shelter but symbol. Raphael observed in silence, honoring what the moment meant. He knew he hadn't saved Clara. He'd merely added, stood beside without stealing the spotlight. And that's rare, because loving is also knowing your place, not in front, not behind, at their side. And side by side they rebuilt, without hurry, without spectacle, with presence. The walls once cold. Now heard other voices, voices of women starting over, voices that cried but didn't hide, voices learning to name their pain without fearing they'd look weak. Clara was no longer just heir to land. She was heir to courage, ancestry, future. And that no one could take. Time passed. Even when the scars burned, she kept going, not to forget what she'd lived, but to turn the lived into a bridge. Life didn't reward Clara with noisy victories. It offered her a quiet truth. In the end, what prevails isn't hatred or force or vengeance. It's the courage to live with dignity, even when everything seems determined to steal it. And with feet firm on the earth, memory in her chest, and love in the right season, Clara moved forward, whole, unshakable, finally home. If this story stirred something inside you, if at any moment you felt seen, welcomed, understood, then this channel is your refuge. Here, every story is a mirror, and every pain is a path back home. Subscribe and walk with us, because some truths can no longer be lived in silence.